Thank you very much for the kind introduction. My name is Asuka, serving as the director of the climate change group at IGES. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak in front of you. Rather than giving you an overview or framework, I would like to give you some few points based upon my personal view on what are the focal points in the current round of discussions and negotiations. So these are purely my personal views. And hopefully, I hope that my comments as such will lead to the upcoming discussion. So please position my presentation as an appetizer for the main course to come later on. We'll have session 1 and session 2 this afternoon. Session 1 is the future of the international climate change regime. This is the shortened version, but basically we will think about the ongoing current negotiations. We will have panelists who have long participated in the international negotiations, and therefore we will ask them what the pending issues are, how they foresee the future, whether they see prospects for possible agreement. And we truly hope to have candid views coming out of the panelists. I think the biggest question in our minds would be how they assess COP17. Do they consider that to have been a historic achievement? Some say yes. Some say it wasn't dramatic, that they were rather disappointed. So that would also depend on the expectations that they had prior to going into the meeting. But first and foremost, I would like to ask this question to those who had participated in the negotiation, how they evaluate the achievements of COP17. This is rather an outdated photograph when taken at the COP13 that was held in Bali. The last day was a troublesome day, and there was great controversy that had led to a suspension of the negotiations at one point in time. You may know that this person looking forefront is Minister Gabriel, the Environment Minister of Germany, and the person showing his back is the chief negotiator representing China. At the time of COP13, this kind of controversy had taken place, but in the end, agreement was reached to adopt the Bali roadmap, and that was what COP13 was all about. This is COP17 last year. For yourselves, some of you may already feel nostalgic seeing these photos. Some of you may be amazed that already 3 months had passed. This was taken on the last day, Sunday morning again. There was disruption of the negotiations, and the chairman came to the center of the forum and asked the participants to come to the center and talk directly, mutually with each other. On the left, the lady with looking sideways is the chief negotiator, Ms. Hedego of EU, and on the right you can see the faces of the negotiators representing India and China, and this person faced back is the US negotiator. And this was also taken at the same timing, similar meeting, but this even makes the conflict even more stark. EU and India, well, I wouldn't say conflict in the end, because these two countries had served central roles. And as I will touch upon later, there were wills amongst participating parties to bring some agreement out of Durban that had led to an agreement. What's the difference between Bali and Durban? That's a frequently asked question, but as you can see, obviously from comparing these photos, in Bali, people stood, but at least the negotiators were talking sat down in Durban. So that's the big difference, standing up or sitting down. Now, going into the substance, the extension of the second commitment period of Kyoto Protocol has been sort of decided upon, although details need to be worked out in coming months and years. And at the same time, parties are to enter into a framework that would have some kind of legal effect, and the timescale has also been decided upon, which is referred to as the Durban platform. However, specifically what kind of framework is to be built, carte blanche is not an overexpression, and we need to create that framework from scratch, which hasn't been decided yet at all. Now, you know the phrase CBDR. This wasn't included in the Durban platform. Some people consider this to be a dramatic deliverable. However, common but differentiated responsibility in the negotiations need to be addressed. And this is an important focal point. It's not just a picture of developed versus developing nations. Even amongst developed nations, there could be common but differentiated responsibilities between developed nations themselves. So this is an issue that is unavoidable and that have to be settled in one way or the other. Next, especially of great interest for Japan, is again the market mechanism and what role is to be given to the market mechanisms. Fundamentally, emissions trading systems are being introduced in various countries on this planet. They've already been implemented or are being introduced. Between academia and political decision makers, the pending issue is the policy mix with carbon tax, subsidy, and regulation. And this has become a focal issue. When emission trading scheme is introduced, that's not the end in itself. We need to consider the policy mix with other measures such as these tax, subsidy, regulation. Another global issue is the future of Kyoto mechanism. And what would come next? Will it be slightly over Kyoto mechanism with an add-on or a completely new mechanism? The answer is yet to come out, but there are various interests towards what new mechanism will be brought about. This photo is very outdated. You may find this nostalgic, but Kyoto Takaragaike Prince Hotel, which was the venue of COP3, and this is the birthplace of the Kyoto Protocol, or a symbol of the Kyoto Protocol. And I think this was the place that symbolizes the international negotiation or international cooperation. And another point, in a way, this may be the most important issue. Already, climate warming, global warming is occurring, and extraordinary weather is occurring that had led to many disasters around the globe. And all stakeholders, in a way, have formed a consensus. Of course, they cannot be responded to one by one, but if CO2 emission continue without anything done, these climate-driven disasters can only exacerbate. And not only do we need to reduce emissions, but at the same time, we need to think about resilient adaptation towards disasters and damages. And should those frameworks be considered on the global basis or country by country? And should this be taken up as a part of the security issue? This is yet another topic that I hope to hear from the panelists their views. And in this context, be it climate security or damage, when we consider these issues, 2 degrees Celsius versus the current commitment of emissions reduction, the so-called gigaton gap, is an issue that cannot be overlooked. And people talk about the need to increase the level of ambition. And there's almost a consensus that there is a need to increase the level of ambition. But how do we do that? CBDR is one factor that is relevant, and hardly anything has been decided on the means to upgrade the level of ambition. And this is my own personal hypothesis, but in Durban, there were high ambition countries, the so-called high ambition countries, and maybe we can call them members of the Durban Alliance. And Cartagena Dialogue Group was the core of or is the core of what may be emerging as the Durban Alliance. And it is my notion that this kind of grouping is being formed. Cartagena Group minus Umbrella Group plus South Africa would be the accurate definition of the Durban Alliance. But in effect, almost all of them are energy importers, although there are some exceptions. This is how I look at the situation. Then, when we think about the future composition of the international negotiations, we believe that this battle or picture would be, on one hand, importers versus exporters. We did have that kind of diagram even before, but as this negotiation enters into a new stage, we think that this difference will become even more harsher. One example is the extension of the EU ETS to the area of aviation. Basically, pricing carbon is the same as pricing energy, and in that case, what should energy importers do in terms of energy security, pricing energy? Of course, when we think about trade, if your counterparty is pricing energy but no price on carbon, of course, you would fill the gap with tariff. And even under WTO rules, there is a possibility that this would be considered as being legal and legitimate. But at any rate, some kind of carbon pricing has to be done. And if the counterparty doesn't do any pricing, then there has to be some kind of mechanism that will force the counterparty to factor that into pricing. That began in aviation, that may go to maritime, and that may expand to some other sector as well. It started from aviation, it may go into maritime, it may go into other sectors, and I would like to hear your views on that possibility. Session 2, as indicated here, is under the title of Support for Sustainable, Low Carbon and Climate Resilient Development was Rio Plus 20. Each country is taking measures to promote green growth, and we wish to hear case studies in each of the participating countries. What is of great importance is ensuring financing, governance, the role between private finance and public money, and the source of financing. To a certain extent, no one has been able to solve this issue, and we need to consider this from scratch. The subject of Rio Plus 20 is green growth. However, what would be the relationship between green growth and climate change, and how should we define green growth? I hope to clarify the definition during the course of the session. I believe that there are 3 gaps. One is the gigaton gap. In other words, 2 degrees Celsius objective. If that were to be met, reduction in the order of gigaton would have to be achieved, but the means to do that has not been decided upon, and some kind of financing mechanism is necessary, but not only on the global scale, but domestically by various countries. But so far, we've not been able to identify the source of those financing. And finally, mental gap or psychological gap exists. There are people who think that climate change response is important. There are those who don't think that it is such a crucial issue. So this kind of mental gap needs to be fulfilled. Putnam, Poland, COP photo gallery was set up on that occasion, and I was shocked to see this image. This, in fact, is happening in reality, which we need to prevent. But then on the other hand, there are some people who don't prioritize measures against climate warming, global warming. I wouldn't unilaterally say that that's all evil. However, how do we shift that mental gap? I hope that everyone in this room will begin to consider this issue. This will be the final slide. Let's try. Let's do our efforts. It's easier said than done, because it would require specific strategies and tactics. What kind of alliance between countries ought to be formed, and what strategies should be defined, and what tactics should be implemented. We truly hope that the discussions during the course of this afternoon will be as specific as possible. Of course, I do not expect that perfect strategies and tactics will come overnight, but if we are able to obtain some clues as we proceed towards these goals, we will be able to prove that this event has been fruitful. Now, let's begin our work to begin this discussion. Thank you for your kind attention.